Hello, Sergeants Major of Sergeant Major Course DL Class 45. This is Sergeant Major Jason Leeworthy here at my house in lovely Fort Bliss, Texas, across the street from the Academy. Um, Wanted to take a few minutes today to talk to you about your capstone paper. Before I go any further, I want to say this is not an official Army video. This is just Jason Leeworthy trying to give you some ideas and help you think through your paper and your topic. So if I look down, I'll have some notes. I'll say this is the second version of this video. Thank you to the students that have watched it and give me a little bit of feedback. So I'm going to try to expound a little bit on topic selection and kind of working through the issue from my original video. But I'm going to discuss your capstone, what it is not, kind of the layout of your paper, and then your topic selection. Disclaimer number two, a couple points. I'm going to use some debated issues in the Army just as examples. So please know that what I say here is not necessarily my position. It's just talking about the ability to look at multiple sides of an issue, different philosophical assumptions and things like that. So hopefully nobody's offended, but they're current and relevant issues. So as Sergeant Majors, I think we ought to be able to have a discussion about them. Anyway, point number one, your capstone. What is it and what is it not? So your capstone is a literature review, and that is simply a research paper where you are investigating published documents, books, things by professionals, academic, scholarly sources in a certain field of study. You can also use official Army reports, official Army surveys, things like that that are published that you have access to. What your paper is not is, number one, it's not a personal experience paper. It's not, I did this and I did that and in my unit, things like that. You can maybe use like one example if it from your own experience if it directly relates to the point you're trying to make. But you should introduce your point, and then here's the research data that I have to support that point, and then in my experience, but you should limit that to like one time in your paper, not more than that. If you're going to use any of that at all, you don't need to really do that at all. Also, you're not going to go out and conduct personal research. You're not going to do your own surveys or conduct your own interviews or create control groups, and do science experiments on them or anything like that. So again, it's literature review is just looking at already published documents by experts in a certain field or using official Army reports to substantiate your claims and examine your topic. Okay, layout of your paper. And I'm going to try to go through this rather quickly. You start with your introduction. All right, you have your title page and you have your bibliography reference page there, whatever. But you have your introduction. You give a very brief overview of the history of the issue, and then you talk about the main problem, and then you give your thesis statement. I'm going to argue that the Army made the right decision to allow women in combat arms based on X, Y, and Z. And those 3 points there, I like to include those that let your reader know the main things that you're going to talk about in your paper. That should be about 1 page. Okay. Next, you're going to have either some historical background on the issue if you need to dig a little bit deeper, and give any starting philosophical assumptions that you have if it's necessary. Now, if you're going to write about why the Army should adopt a new rifle versus, whatever, or a new pistol, or buy a new tank, then you probably don't need a lot of philosophy about that. You just list your evidence, why it's more cost effective, things of that nature. But so you want to give a little bit of historical background. For example, if you're going to talk about the Army, how the Army changed its mind and accepted homosexual marriage, you don't need to go back 2,000 years. You can talk about maybe prior to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, say, hey, this is what the general social consensus was about the issue, and then in the 90s we had Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then 2015 or 2016 became more socially acceptable, and the Army adopted its position on current position on gay marriage. So that'll be, again, that's about 1 page in length, and then you get into your body of your paper where you're addressing your primary points of argument. So introduction, 1 page, historical background, 2 page, and then you talk about the body, and those are your primary points of argument. And those should each be about 2 to 3 pages. If you have if you have 2 or 3 points of argument, a couple pages for each, then you get to recommendations, and then your conclusion, and there's your 8 to 10 pages. So no problem, right? Okay, so that's the layout. Next, I want to talk about your topic selection, and I'm going to digress a little bit about as I talk about things to avoid into some considerations, philosophical considerations, and examining different points of view. So point number 1 about topic selection, it should relate directly to something that you've studied in the Sergeant Major's course. Okay, it should not just be some random issue at your unit or something like that. Maybe you want to say that the Army should adopt a joint model that the Navy uses or something like that. Or maybe you want to discuss, in the Sergeant Major's course, you use the experiential learning model. And we've since adopted that across all the spectrum of NCO professional development courses, all the way down to BLC. Maybe you want to address the fact that you don't think that's a good model because junior enlisted soldiers like that don't have the necessary time in the Army and experience to really effectively employ that, because they don't have that. You're supposed to come and share, your experiences, things like that. But if anybody is new to a certain field of study, I don't know very much about marine biology. If I went and took a class, I can share my general life experience, but I don't know anything about the subject matter. So I need somebody that's more informed to guide me. Need a lot more direct teacher mentorship to help me through that subject versus an area that I already know a lot about. So again, your topic should be directly related to something that you've studied here during the Sergeant Major's course. Point number 2, try to avoid the hypothetical or future. Now, you can, after you do your research paper and you go through it and work through it, you can say, based on all this evidence that I've presented here, the Army should think about this in the future. But your whole paper can't just be, well, if the Army does this, this might happen, or if the Army does that, that might happen, and it can't be too broad, like creating an ethical climate. Okay, that's a very broad, and in some of the earlier papers I saw some broad sweeping statements. You have to be specific. You have to have a point and talk directly about that point and stay on target with that point. Okay, also, don't try to pick a topic that hasn't happened yet, like the Army Combat Fitness Test. Yes, there's research and data, but it hasn't been implemented, and so you can't really describe the impact on the Army for something that hasn't been implemented yet. So try to stay away from that. Okay, point number 3, don't be overly broad in the scope. If you're going to argue that obesity is a problem, then you have to have sufficient, if you're going to say it's a problem in the whole Army, you better have sufficient evidence to demonstrate that it is in fact a problem in the Army. Now, if you're going to say it's a problem in our state, National Guard, that's one thing. If you're going to say that recruiters can do unethical actions, and you're going to argue that the Army has created the conditions that almost force them to do that, again, you have to limit it in scope. Is it across the whole Army or just the regional command? So you have to have evidence, and your research has to be able to support, whatever level you're aiming at. Okay, so again, as you research a topic and as you think about your topic, know that you don't necessarily have to have a solid position when you start thinking about and doing your research. Like, for example, the issue of transgender. 2016, they said, okay, now the Army's reconsidering it, still, weighing things like that. So if you want to look at the issue, do your research first before you decide to argue for or against it. Now, you may have a position that you already feel strongly about, that you're planning on doing your paper on, about maybe suicide. You feel strongly about that, and you already have an idea. That's fine, but if you're not dogmatic one way or the other on an issue, know that as you do your research and you find more evidence, you can change your position and then update it before your final submission of your paper. Okay, I'm gonna get to point number 5 here. Let me say one more thing about your research. Again, try to avoid making overstatements. I can't stress that enough. To say every NCO in the Army is dissatisfied. You can't prove that, or all junior enlisted don't like their leaders. Avoid very generic statements that, make a statement, support it with evidence, draw your conclusion, and then transition to your next point. Open with your primary thought, give evidence to support your position, discuss it, and then draw your conclusion there at the end of the section. All right. So now I want to talk about the analysis. How do you analyze a topic? Okay, this is a little bit philosophical and critical thinking type. So there's 2 basic ways you can look at something, especially if you're going to try to take a contrary position, or you're going to really dig in and examine an issue and the thoughts about it. The first is the logical outworking of said position. Okay, and you can use criteria to evaluate a certain position. I'm going to give you a little personal example here. When I wrote my master's thesis for the fellowship, I talked about education for social justice as a philosophy, and my thesis was that it's not a good fit for the United States because we don't live in an area where we're really oppressed. And I used some criteria like logical coherence, existential viability. Can you really live out such a theory? And I made some arguments why that. I give you one example. So I argued that, and the idea premise of education for social justice is the philosophy that education within a society should serve to further a more just and equitable society. And so one of the points that I argued was that in education, there's no source of authority. And so one of my philosophical arguments was you have to have a source of authority to impose a moral duty on anybody. In education, you don't have that, so it doesn't work well within that construct. So anyway, you can establish some criteria and look at different points of view. Take, for example, women in the military. There's some social norms that have changed over the course of time. My starting philosophical assumption would not be that Americans ever thought that women couldn't do it, but we didn't want them to have to go and be exposed to all the horrible stuff that goes on in combat. So that would be maybe a starting assumption that I would list, and then I would explore that idea and note that how society's views have changed and things like that, and then come out on one side or the other. Okay, so those are some areas you can look at. Another area that you can examine, and this is where you really get deep, is at starting assumptions. Okay, and I'm going to use the issue of transgender, the Army's adoption of and change of policy in 2016. So when I came in the Army, gender and sex were synonymous. Your biological sex and gender were considered the same thing. Well, as research has progressed into that field, there's a belief that gender is a societal or cultural construct, and so biological sex and gender are now not the same thing. The Army has redefined or adopted that position based on modern research. Now, not everybody believes that. Some people still believe that whatever sex you're born with determines your gender. And if you wanted to explore that, you could say, well, a lot of people, and arguably younger, now we're seeing younger people want to transition. But if, and the argument is that that's just an internal feeling that they have that this is what they're supposed to be. Okay, fine. But if it's internal and innate to humans, then how can it be an external construct? Okay, so to me, that's a contradiction in that starting assumption. So again, that's just an example that I wanted to use there. So, but again, as you work through your paper, you can, if there's ideas or thoughts that you disagree with, explore them. Make the reader understand why you don't agree with them. Explore their reasoning process. Is their thinking fallacious? Are they creating contradictions? I give you another example here. All right. I believe one of the starting assumptions when we changed our idea about gay marriage is as long as it's consenting adults, then what's the problem? Okay, fine. So, but what if you apply that to the issue of adultery? The adultery is still viewed as wrong in the Army, but if people have an open marriage, and there was a general I knew that got kicked out a couple of years ago, won't name any names, but he had an open marriage, or that's what the article said anyway. And so, and if everybody involved is a consenting adult, well, why is that wrong? But it's not. So the point being is you can look and examine some of these things that, and maybe your thesis would be, the Army has some contradictory standards and needs to go back and look holistically at its view on sexuality and different things like that. So again, these are out kind of in the philosophical area and things like that. If you're writing about, the Army needs to adopt, a different educational model, then you probably won't have all the controversial, your paper won't be so controversial or something like that. But so I hope this video helps. And again, thanks to those that have watched the previous ones. If you have any feedback for me, please let me know, and that's it. Thanks.